It was legal to mail children in packages via the USPS from 1913 to 1920. What are some not fun facts? Depressing summary at the end of the video. If you show symptoms of rabies, your chances of dying are nearly 100%. Like pancreatic cancer. If you're showing symptoms, you're almost definitely already dead. There was an NPR report about a doctor who put a young girl with the rabies virus into a medically induced coma. He figured that since most people with rabies actually died of dehydration, he can wait the virus out, giving the girl a feeding tube and waking her up after the virus had run its course. He was right. You will watch most of the people you love die, and the rest will watch you die. It's guaranteed to happen. Unless you are killed at the same time by a plane crash or so. As the youngest of 9 kids who also still has both his parents, this has been sinking in with me lately. I haven't lost many family. Grandparents all passed before I was born, or friends yet at this point in my life at age 37 to death. And statistically I'm probably going to outlive most or likely all of them because I'm the healthiest and youngest. The second half of my life is gonna suck funerals wise. There's somebody out there that you're completely compatible with and you get along perfectly and it's your perfect partner. But you'll probably never get to meet them. My friend lives in somewhat rural Washington State, USA. She got on a dating app a few years ago, and on a whim she said her interested location is global. She matched with a guy who lived in Germany. When she asked him why he also set his location to global, he said, "What are the odds, in all the world, that my soulmate is in my own city?" They're engaged. America's first baseball star, Jim Creighton, died at 21 from a rupture he got from hitting a home run. He injured himself in a game when he suffered a ruptured abdominal hernia hitting a home run. The rupture caused internal bleeding, and he died 4 days later. The youngest girl to ever give birth was 5 years, 7 months, and 21 days old. I can't even imagine the labor pains. The size difference between baby and mother wouldn't have been too much. To this day, she still refuses to be interviewed about it. It was no doubt her dad or uncle, or someone the family would want to protect due to fear of shame. It still happens way too often. You've walked by and seen people that have died very painfully in the last year. Recently an old co-worker of mine said hi to me when we bumped into each other in a shop and we chatted for a bit. The next day in work he was crushed by a trailer and his spine was pushed up into his brain. Someone replied, "A few days before Christmas I picked up a package from my downstairs neighbor and wished her a Merry Christmas. 4 hours later she caused a car crash that killed 4, including her, and injured 12. Someone else replied, "I served 2 people at work that within days of me serving them, they were in the news because they were murdered. One by a jealous ex. He killed her, stuffed her in a suitcase, hiding it in her car, and then within 24 hours of her body being found he killed himself in a deliberate car crash." The other was a mother who was decapitated by her daughter, in front of a younger member of the same family. Really makes you realize just how short life is. The British East India Company took over Bengal, India, and their policies caused the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. It caused the death of 10 million, a third of the population. The British have caused so many artificial famines. The Irish Famine of 1847. Bengal again in 1943. Yet no one takes them to task over it. Brain activity has been recorded for up to 10 minutes after death. What is that person experiencing during those last minutes of life? Another fact, during those 10 minutes, time isn't perceived the same way as when you were alive. So in your head, those 10 minutes can last years. During this time, it is said that you live your life again. Maybe you're already dead, and you're in those 10 minutes, who knows? Time dilation. If every single thing in your life has already happened and what you're experiencing now is the brain replaying its life in extraordinarily vivid detail, almost like a dream, except how would you ever know? How are you sure that this is the first playthrough? I guess, how do I know that I'm not already dead and these last couple decades have been my last little lights of brain activity? Or even worse yet, this is the real run and I gotta live it all over again. Typing this out like this actually gets me thinking, if you knew you had to relive your life as vivid and detailed as it was the first time, a second time, start to finish, what would you do differently? Or would you do it all the same? You have 1 to 10 minutes to live, but every time you breathe it resets. Now you are very aware of your own breathing. You're welcome. Whales and dolphins die by not having enough energy to surface for air, so they slowly sink into the depths of the ocean and suffocate. A lot of people are stuck in jobs that make them very unhappy and may increase their chances of committing suicide. I've come to realize this as an adult. Yes, a lot of people have higher paying jobs, but I see what meds they're on. Someone replied, "It's true. Those of us earning any sort of decent money are basically stuck working those jobs if we have other people depending on us." By the time I was 30 or so, adult male suicide was no longer a mystery to me. Between our jobs and how devastating relationships can be, the number of men I know that are wrecked financially following a divorce is high. I'm surprised more of us don't kill ourselves. Many of us are just doing it slowly with alcohol. Your comfort is only possible due to the suffering of millions toiling away in nightmarish sweatshops, factories, mines, fields, etc. Technically it's possible without, but humans are greedy and want that cheap labor. There is no such thing as responsibly sourced products, only different degrees of exploitation. Of course, we should work to minimize exploitation, and eventually eliminate it entirely, but with the current economic paradigm, all consumption is exploitative. A majority of kidnappings, rapes, and murders are committed by people familiar to the victim. Stranger danger is largely BS. That's the problem, that kid is more likely to be attacked by a relative or family friend than by an unfamiliar adult in public. Males are more likely to be murdered by a stranger than a female is to be murdered by a stranger. But in general, the vast majority of murders are committed by someone who knew the victim, male or female. When they perform executions by shooting, the reason they have several shooters is so that no one knows who shot the fatal shot. On the other hand, every hit adds up to the sum of injuries that lead to death, and contributing to this still makes you responsible for causing a death. Consider a shooting squad of 6 men all low-key, not wanting to kill, and all hitting the shoulders. That'd be even worse. Technically we're all brain damaged to some extent. Adrenaline, high cortisol, little bumps to head, alcohol and many other chemicals, contact with toxic people and people in general, those are some of the causes of that. 25,000 people die of hunger, every day. And all of those deaths would be preventable if humans weren't greedy money grabbers. We have more than enough food to feed the world. When I say this, people call me edgy or teen as defense mechanism. Just accept we are all greedy organisms. Get off your moral high ground that you made up in your schizophrenic cognitive dissonant human head and accept you are like the rest, greedy organism. We humans are as good as our biology dictates, just as it is with other organisms, but we judge so much because we are moral social animals, so it comes naturally to us. But when something like helping the starving ones, and giving up unnecessary luxuries and excess appears, something that isn't encouraged by society, we suddenly aren't as good. Because we are not conditioned to care. We are conditioned to ignore such things. We are as good as our environment and conditioning. Reminds me of how absolutely everyone thinks that if they were born in Nazi Germany they wouldn't be Nazis. Humans really overestimate how good they are, or rather underestimate their evil. Hitler was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. This was a political move. Hitler had forbidden his people from going to collect their Nobel Prizes, so someone nominated him. Cysticercosis is when a tapeworm manages to lodge itself inside your brain, causing big cysts to form in your head, causing headaches and seizures. In Australia, there is a plant called the Gympie gympie, otherwise known as the suicide plant. When touched, it delivers multiple stings with a long-lasting neurotoxin that is so painful that people would rather kill themselves than live through a few days of excruciating pain, and then a further several years of lesser pain, or full reoccurrence in the correct conditions. If the tiny hairs that deliver the stings are not removed, or are buried, the pain will continue for years. The pain, which has been described as feeling like being doused in hot acid and being electrocuted simultaneously, is so bad that people have been driven mad by it. Horses who have been stung by this plant have literally thrown themselves off cliffs. An ex-serviceman named Cyril Bromley is known to have fallen into one of the plants during World War II. Driven mad by it, he had to be strapped to a bed to prevent himself from committing suicide. Another rather unfortunate officer is known to have shot himself in the head after using one of the plant's leaves as toilet paper. Rather than live with the pain in his rear end, he chose to end his life. The work ethics in a Chinese factory are so grueling that employees tend to commit suicide during their shifts. To prevent this, the employers place nets all around the factory so that when employees try to take to a swan dive, the nets would catch them and they'd be forced to go back to work. This is still happening. One of these companies is Foxconn, which is a large supplier for Apple. Shoebill mothers will only raise one chick. So when 2 eggs are laid, the mother will leave the nest to let them hatch. When those eggs hatch, one is always aggressive and violent, and the other chick is always the timid and sensitive one. The violent one immediately rushes out of the egg to assault the timid one on sight. When the mother comes back to see the aftermath, the timid one limps to its mother for comfort and protection. The mother then takes her time beating the timid one to death with her bill, until it's nothing but a mangled lump of meat and bones, and raises the aggressive chick. I saw this in a Netflix documentary on the animals of Africa. David Attenborough actually had to manifest into corporal form, after the end of that particular scene, to console the viewer and remind us that nature can be scary as hell sometimes. During World War II, many American corporations aided, funded, and supplied Nazi Germany, with many of the heads of these corporations agreeing with German political stances at the time, especially when compared to FDR. American Telephone and Telegraph Company, more commonly known as AT&T, designed and installed the telephone lines used by the Germans during the occupation of France to allow for communication directly to Berlin. Coca-Cola sold their beverages to the Nazis, who promptly distributed them to soldiers in North Africa. There were even reports of German pilots tying towels around several bottles of Coke, tying them to their aircraft, and flying up to altitude. When they land, their Cokes would be frozen, needing to chip the frozen towel off, perfect for a hot day in North Africa. Another small company called Ford had manufacturing plants in Germany, where many German half-tracks were fitted with Ford engines. In fact, in the 1940s, after the war, Ford sued the United States government for damages done to their factories during the war, and they won. Standard Oil, the company which held a monopoly on oil and gasoline throughout most of the world, at the time, sold their oil to everyone, including the Germans. In fact, the only ones they didn't sell to were the Japanese, who had been placed under an extremely strict embargo by the American government, forcing Japan's hand in to launch a strike against Pearl Harbor. Japan committed the same if not worse atrocities as Germany in World War II, but the history books often forget it. The Soviets tried to establish a self-sufficient prison island. However, because there was a quota officials had to fill, most inmates were city dwellers that got arrested over practically nothing and had no prior experience with farming. That combined with incompetent officials, cruel guards, no clean water and the only food source being flour that was mostly hoarded by brigadiers that abused their position led to a rapid onset of hunger, disease and death. The ones that didn't starve to death, died from disease or got shot by the guards grew so desperate that they started cutting pieces off the living that were too weak to fight back. 15% of all pregnancies will end in an unprovoked abortion within 22 weeks. Roughly every second woman will experience an unprovoked abortion during her childbearing years. That's a fact that I already have a couple friends who would have benefited greatly from, before said abortions. Somehow it's easier to bear when you aren't the only one. If your eyes get red and irritated when you go swimming in a public pool, it's not necessarily because of the chlorine in the water. They're reacting to compounds formed by the chlorine's reaction with the pee, poo particles and sweat in there. People suffering from a range of depressive disorders tend to assess themselves closer to the assessment of those around them. People without any depressive disorder see themselves in a more positive light than those around them. Thus, according to the same research, depression makes you assess yourself more realistically. This is called depressive realism and it's been disputed, but when you look at all the logic brothers around, you can kind of sense that happiness and content didn't develop that mindset, nor that it provides either of these. 79% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Meaning, 79% of Americans are serfs. Replace working for food and shelter which someone else owns and is willing to give you in exchange for selling your labor to them. Replace food and shelter with money which can theoretically be used to purchase food and shelter. You are supposed to have excess free cash to advance yourself economically, but if you don't have any free cash at the end of the month, you are a serf. Coincidentally, 20% of Americans own 80% of the stock in the stock market. Read, 20% of Americans own nearly every company that has shareholders. Wages haven't kept pace with productivity. Productivity has doubled since 1970 but wages have remained the same. Where's it going, you may ask? Trickle-down economics at its finest. Abolish capitalism and replace unjust or ineffective authority with worker-owned democratic free federation. Arthur Shawcross was released from prison after the murder and mutilation, necrophilia, genital cannibalization of two very young children. Psychiatrists told the penitentiary he was released he would likely kill and torture again. He was released, and tortured, killed and did the same to as many as 11 women in New York. He was on parole in the town that were being murdered and nobody bothered go investigate him, and police had several missteps that could have prevented several of the killings and caught him much sooner than he was. During the French Revolution, doctors would observe recently beheaded people still being able to blink. It resulted in them asking questions to them and they would respond by blinking until they finally died. I think the longest someone was able to respond to questions was 30 seconds after being beheaded. If someone threatens you with a weapon and they want to move you to another location, your chance of dying increases tenfold if you agree to relocate. The Mongolians, to ensure everyone showed up for a war, would issue a proclamation saying that the last person who showed up to training camp would be tortured and murdered in front of everyone. The last legal execution by drawing and quartering happened the year Henry David Thoreau was born. Of 11,000 Civil War battlefield surgeons, only 327 had pre-war experience with surgery. The first 5 people who stopped applauding at Stalin's 1938 Presidium were sent to the Gulag for 10 years, their crime was that they stopped applauding. Joseph Mengele kept a collection of children's eyes pinned to the wall in his office. In the Vietnam War, American forces fired 50,000 bullets for every dead enemy. Gang violence in New York saw a 600% increase on September 11. J.D. Salinger carried the first draft of Catcher in the Rye in his breast pocket as he stormed Omaha Beach. His trauma contributed to Holden Caulfield's. In 1973, 75% of American 25-year-olds lived with their spouse. Now, it's 19%. Ronald McDonald was quietly phased out of all McDonald's advertising in 2013. Kellogg's Corn Flakes was originally marketed as an anti-masturbation cereal, and advertisements told parents that if their boys ate it they wouldn't commit the sin of masturbation. Tim Allen got caught in an airport with 1.5 pounds of cocaine and only served 3 years in prison. 200,000 Americans die each year because of human error in hospitals. Bears are cannibals, they eat their own cubs after hibernation. Male bears, like pigs, are called boars and female bears, like pigs, are called sows. Humans are the only animal that are aware most of their lives that they will eventually die. When humans go through emotional toil, their amygdala increases in size and hippocampus decreases. Slowly, the hippocampus will return to normal, but the amygdala never will. Doctors are not allowed to participate in executions because of the Hippocratic Oath. The executors are usually not professionals, hence the high rate of botched executions. Because there is no sound in the vacuum of space, a human fart is louder than a supernova. It was legal to mail children in packages via the USPS from 1913 to 1920. 25 million people are sex slaves at this very moment. At the end of a cattle train carrying prisoners there was usually a drag, a metal scraper with teeth which passed close to the ties and caught the body of anyone trying to escape, and dragged him over the ties to his death. Next to the Gorky amusement park in Ukraine, under the swings and carousel, and the funhouse and the games area, 9,439 corpses were found in a mass grave in the 1960s. There were no bowls, spoons, or forks at the transit prisons and the prisoners had none of their own either. They were herded to the boiler by the dozens and the mash was ladled into their caps or the flaps of their jackets. In 1905, the documented height of capital punishment in Russia, 45 prisoners were shot each month. But it is well documented that in one prison in Leningrad alone, they shot more than 200 men every night through the whole of 1937. The British brought tanks to a refugee camp housing 18,000 including women, children, and injured. When these people refused to go they beat them with clubs and tossed them into the trucks, and women threw their babies beneath the tank's tracks before following themselves. This fact sounds false, but the cemetery still exists in Leans. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button for more fact videos. Click the right box for the Reddit Facts playlist. And share more disturbing facts in the comments below.